Hello, my name is Aiden. I am a transmasculine, queer identified person. I was assigned female at birth and started my transition in my mid 20s to male. I'm also a disabled veteran, so I have a lot of varied communities that I'm a part of. My partner is filming me, and they identify as non binary, so you kind of get a mix of people in this house, so that's pretty cool. I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of some of the difficulties that my community faces, and I'm only going to be coming at you from my personal experience as a transmasculine human. I don't understand, I've never been through being a gender nonconforming or a non binary person, so these are really kind of just my stories and my experiences, and I wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page as to kind of where this information is coming from. Generally, if you want to understand a gender nonconforming person's experience, it's best just to talk to them personally. That's usually the best route to go. So, first, I want to talk about my medical experiences. As a disabled person, I seek a lot more medical care than probably the average human being. And that means that I'm at a lot of different doctors and in a lot of different clinics. And over the years, I've had both good and bad experiences. I'm going to talk about the negative a little bit first. I've been refused care. I've also been literally laughed at in an office. I was outed as a trans man in Amarillo, Texas, in front of people who live in Amarillo, Texas. So imagine probably very conservative human beings, which for me was ultimately, had the potential to be a very dangerous issue. And that was by a doctor, like a clinical doctor. I have also had the experience of kind of my care being directed certain directions because I'm trans. Having to get a pregnancy test every single time I get an x-ray is beyond ridiculous, partly because my body doesn't work like that anymore and I don't sleep with cisgender men. So but it was a hoop that I had to jump through every time, regardless of what my body was saying to the clinic. So those are just some of the negative experiences, at least in like specifically the medical community of things that I've dealt with. Just recently, I was assigned a new doctor at the VA, and she actually came in and asked me, what are the pronouns you prefer? Just huge, such a huge. That statement alone makes me understand that she kind of gets the gender spectrum and wants to make sure that she's being inclusive and correct in talking to me. That's the safest I've ever felt in an office. I've had other offices, that have been very good about my pronouns. Nurses are almost 100% great, like very understanding, and if they don't get something, they tend to ask questions a lot. So when I was outed in Texas, I ended up going to the patient advocate, which is a service that the VA provides. And after a few hoop jumps with that on its own, I was asked to speak with the new director that was at the Amarillo VA. And I sat down with him and I said, listen, I know for a fact that I'm not the only trans person that comes to this hospital. And as a veteran, I deserve to receive the care that I have, and I also deserve to be treated with respect. So do the other people who identify somewhere on the gender spectrum as other than binary. And so he asked, what are some of the things that we can do to improve that? And I kind of filled him in on just some basics, appropriate pronouns, not outing people, which seems like that should be obvious, but apparently it's not. And then, like a year or two later, I actually had a friend message me. I no longer lived in Amarillo, but she messaged me and she said, I just left Amarillo Pride, and the VA actually had a booth here this year. And that was so powerful to me in such a very conservative community to see the VA making sure that they step up and represent all veterans was huge. It was very nice to hear that. So that's kind of my medical experiences. Mental health ends up being it's its own issue, and as a disabled veteran, I also have PTSD. I suffer from depression and just some other kind of mental health issues. So I also spend a lot of time in mental health clinics. You would think that you would get I would say more understanding care in mental health. Like, I kind of figured that most people who go into mental health have at least been somewhat educated on the gender spectrum and how to treat people who identify, as somebody in the queer community. And as far as my personal therapist that I've been assigned goes, I've had really good success. Um, but when it comes to psychologists, I've had some difficulties. There tends to be this assumption, and I've heard other trans people say this assumption that all of my mental health issues are attached to the fact that I'm transgender, which is totally not the case, and really kind of minimizes my experiences and my mental health issues. I'm a suicide survivor. I've attempted twice in my life. And these issues, none of these issues were attached to anything about my transgender experience, my gender identity, or even my queer identity. It was attached to severe PTSD that I, managed to get while I was serving in the military. So when a clinical provider sits down and says, "Well, I think this might be the issue. You're transgender," it really poo-poos kind of the whole thing, and obviously makes me very uncomfortable as a patient. So as social workers or potential social workers, it's a really good idea to make sure that you let the patient kind of guide you in what they want to share about their experience if they're somewhere on the gender spectrum other than non-binary. That way you can kind of know how to navigate discussions with them, asking preferred pronouns, making sure that they understand that your clinic is, queer friendly. All of those things can change a queer person's experience 100%. And I think it's very important. So those are kind of my in the health field experiences. I wanted to talk about a couple of really negative experiences that I've had as far as my personal life experience. When I was 25, I had just started hormones, so I did not look like I look right now. I still looked very feminine. I still had breasts that I bound. But this is 17 years ago, and the technology as far as binding was a lot different. So it was harder to pass, but I still identified as male, and that's how I presented myself. And I was actually assaulted after work one night, to the point that I literally didn't recognize my own face. Two teenagers decided that they wanted to teach me a lesson. And 17 years ago, this is in Spokane, Washington, which tends to be a more conservative town in Washington. 17 years ago, I did not feel safe going to the police to report it. I was very concerned that I would be dismissed, or that I would run into my own problems dealing with the police force. And a lot of people who vary on the gender spectrum do have a lot of anxiety around police. There's this concern that just because we don't identify as a binary gender, a cisgender binary gender, that we're going to run into problems because it's happened. Not because we're imagining things, but because it's happened to our friends and people that we know. So I think it's really important. Almost every, on the gender spectrum human that I've spoken to has had some sort of either physical trauma or verbal trauma that they've experienced. And And as clinicians, or people who are going to end up being kind of in that field where you're dealing with human beings, I think it's important to also understand that the person that's sitting across from you has probably been through a lot. Even if their experience was minimally difficult, it's still so different from what a cisgender human being experiences that you can't imagine, basically, is what I'm trying to say. You can't imagine what the person sitting across from you has been through. So giving them that space and the room and kind of the support to be able to exist in that space with you as who they are, can work wonders for getting people to open up, for getting people to actually come to their appointments or whatever it is that they need to be doing. So that was my worst trauma experience. I was also assaulted at the community college that I went to, and at the time I was very out. It's a choice that I personally make to be an out transgender person, and I was assaulted in the men's bathroom. They actually called me a faggot, which was almost hilarious because I was engaged to a woman at the time. It was like, you even got the name wrong. You can't even assault me and call me the right thing. So I had a really good friend who was a professor at the college that I went to, and we went down and we talked to the president of the college and the regent and basically anybody who would listen, to kind of just bring up, hey, these are issues that exist and are only going to become more frequent if we don't put a handle on it right now. There needs to be a zero tolerance for hate on the campus, and that needs to be identified. And I was only at that college for 2 years, but I stayed friends with the professor that I spoke to after my assault. We've always been really good friends. And she told me last year they finally put in a gender-neutral bathroom, which is huge. I mean, that's a huge thing. Spokane tends to be a more conservative town, so I'm incredibly proud that they, did that. So I guess that's to say not all bad experiences for me have been bad forever. Positive things have come out of a lot of these experiences. Yeah. Okay, so your professor asked me to talk a little bit about economic justice and probably economic inequality that happens for gender nonconforming, or people who are on that gender spectrum other than binary, or cisgender. I guess that's what I meant to say, other than cisgender. There are a lot of issues that come up for most of us, especially early on in our transition if we're not passing as one of the binary genders, or if you identify as non-binary and kind of identify whatever you feel like on that spectrum. Unfortunately, employers really want to hire somebody who looks like a binary gender and looks very much like that binary gender. And that is, unfortunately, kind of the discrimination that still goes on, trying to find good employment. Even people who have degrees and the experience are struggling still to find work. And it's almost 2020. So we also deal with housing inequality. A lot of transgender people, gender nonconforming people, end up being homeless at some point in their experience. I was. My partner was. Because it's still okay to discriminate against us in pretty much every state when it comes to housing. So that's another kind of financial inequality that we face. The other thing that a lot of people probably don't think about is when we're going through the process of changing our names and changing our gender on all of our documents, when you deal with, say, financial institutions or people who, you have credit with or whatever, You go through this process, and sometimes your name doesn't match your identity, or it doesn't match this other document yet. And in my experience, there was a point in time where the people that were at the bank would not let me pull out money out of my own account because my names didn't match up. So I had to go through this whole process. So I couldn't access my own money because they didn't get it, basically. So that's another thing to consider. And if their documents don't match, applying for things like housing and employment also becomes problematic. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. Um, well, I'm probably running out of time. I mean, I could talk forever about most of these issues, but I think the one thing that I want to really leave you all with is wherever this journey takes you, working in kind of the social field where you're going to be working with other people, is to just provide a space, give people the room to just be themselves and exist in the same space as you. Anyway, that's all I got. Thank you.